All right, thank you very much. Maku, are there any other issues that we need to chat about before we begin with our speaker? All right, then we will reserve the rest of the time for Dr. Ahmed Lachheb, a friend of mine, graduate of Indiana University and now working at University of Michigan. Very excited for the things he will be talking to us about today about design failures and other topics perhaps out of his research and experience. So please join me in welcoming Ahmed to our seminar today, and I'll turn Ahmed the rest of the time over to you. And we'll end about, it'll be about 2:50 your time.
Thank you, Jason. I'm honored that you invited me to speak to this wonderful group of practitioners and scholars. Uh, um, it's noon now in your time, I assume. So good afternoon to you all. I hope you're all doing well. Maku, thanks for the wonderful prayer, and good to see you again, Maku. I think I met you for the first time last year in ACT in Vegas. So good to see you again, buddy. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to talk about my recent scholarly project about design failure in instructional design practice. This is my dissertation study. So I found myself recycling a lot of the slides that I use for my defense slide deck. The dissertation is now submitted to ProQuest at IU, so I'm done with my degree and everything. It's not published or accessible on ProQuest because I requested what we call an embargo on it, and that's a technique that scholars do upon graduating, request an embargo on their dissertation so they can publish an article out of it or a paper out of it. And I had unfortunately learned that lesson the hard way because I found that, and Jason knows about this, and requests also know about this. For my master thesis, I found that a couple of years ago that it was actually plagiarized by some other people and it was published as an article. And that was because it got published as an open access in a database at Grand Valley State, and someone else just picked it up and made an article out of it. Luckily, it's all retracted right now, and I get the credit for my work, but that was a very expensive lesson for me to learn. So that's why I requested an embargo on my dissertation. Unfortunately, I cannot share that with you now, but I'm going to talk extensively about the study. So what you see in the top there is examples of designs that failed. You probably all remember the Concorde, the new Coke, or you've probably seen a building collapse or a bridge. So those are examples of design failed. Like the Concorde failed because it was not sustainable, and we don't have the Concorde anymore, and it caused accident as well. A new Coke failed because people simply didn't like the taste, and now we have other Cokes, but not new Coke. And that bridge collapse at Miami University campus caused a lot of harm and damage. So those are examples of failed design. We study design failure because we want to know what design success is. And we know that design is about introducing change in the world. So we also study design failure to know whether that failure happened at the process level or at the outcome level, or happened at both levels, or what the relation between the process and the outcome too. So this is like a very big meta overview of the concept of design failure and why we need to care about it as designers for learning. So what motivated me behind the study of design failure and instructional design practice is that first, overall, my scholarship at Indiana University, when I started my PhD program, I focused my scholarship on instructional design practice in situ, meaning that I studied design practice as it happens without necessarily trying to apply a very specific instructional design model to what designers are doing. It's more like a grounded approach. So that's my primary research focus area. I've done a couple of studies that are, tackling like the design tools, and there was a publication with Elizabeth Bowling about design judgment as well, and about design precedent. So I've done several studies on that, and the goal is that each study is actually informing the next study. So it's a kind of I'm following a series of related study approach. And the goal of studying instructional design practice for me is that I can inform instructional design scholarship, which is primarily concerned by instructional design theories and design means in the large sense of the word, and inform instructional design education. Professors like Jason and Rick and others, because at the education, always looking for methods and content about how to teach instructional designers and what to teach them at the same time. So why that's important and why we actually should care about that, so what? It matters that we study instructional design practice because we have evidence in literature that we are lacking practice-oriented scholarship. It seems like there are two words of instructional design. There is a word of instructional design as is described in textbooks, and there is a word, or in traditional textbooks, not very recent textbooks, and in the word of, in the actual word of instructional design. And this kind of gap, it affects instructional design education and scholarship and by return practice. The literature that we have in IDT overall, it actually hinders what educator can accomplish in the preparation of ID practitioner in diverse contexts. This is also, several scholars have reached that consensus. And we always asking ourselves, how can scholars design tools to be used in ID practice without actually studying ID practice? In a sense is that how can you design a neighborhood or a public park without actually understanding the needs of the people who actually live in that community? I can make that a little bit concrete. So this is, you probably have seen this method before called personas or learning personas. So as I'm designing my scholarship and I think about the studies that I do, I think of these several personas. The first one is Leo, who is an instructional design technology scholar. He is concerned with proposing models, theories, approaches, things that practitioners and educators need to follow. We have also CJ, who is an instructional design educator. She always wants to know how to teach instructional design students, what to teach them, and really wants her classroom to be aligned with the demands of ID practice. We also have Charlie, who is an IDT student who took an instructional design class and then graduated instructional design degree and then graduated with a degree in instructional design and started to work. And he found that his employer is kind of retraining him or continuing his training. So he found himself not exactly ready to become an instructional designer. And we have also Margaret, who's a senior instructional design practitioner who finds herself rarely relying on things that she learned from her instructional design program. So each of those people have some needs, have some things that they need regarding instructional design. So how can I help them? I can help them by studying instructional design practice in its own terms in order to inform instructional design education, scholarship through empirical description. In that sense, Leo, who is proposing instructional design tools and method and tools, he will be able to, excuse me, excuse me, he'll be able to propose tools that are actually grounded in a genuine understanding of instructional design practice. CJ, who will be teaching instructional design students, will be able to align her classroom experience with the demands of instructional design practice. Charlie, who is a student of CJ in this case, when he learns how to become an instructional designer and he graduates, he will feel that he is ready to tackle the complexities of his work as an instructional designer. As for Margaret, these kind of new tools and opportunities and the scholarship will provide an opportunity for her for reflection, for continuous improvement, and for continuing education. So in a sense that the purpose of this study on design failure, I asked three questions. How do instructional design practitioners define design failure? To what they attribute design failure? And what does design failure mean to them? What's kind of the essence of this phenomenon of design failure? So through these research questions, I produced the following outcomes: a description of how instructional design practitioners define design failure, a description of what elements ID practitioner attribute design failure to, and a description of the essence of this phenomenon, which is called design failure. And when we discuss all these three outcomes, what I was able to produce, what I was able to do is produce implications for instructional design technology scholarship and instructional design education. And all these outcomes, of course, are grounded in the accounts of design failure as told by ID practitioners themselves, And when I say ID practitioners, I really mean instructional designers here. And the interpretations of the practitioner accounts that honor their voice, meaning that it's grounded in what they actually say, and evidence literature and design theory. So there are two major theories from design theory that inform the study. First is that Nelson and Solomon, the design way. This is the general theoretical framework of the study, and it helped me to frame what design is and how it occurs and provide a definition on what we mean by when we say the word design and what role designer plays in the design process. And this theory also argues that success and failure of design could not be placed elsewhere. It actually should be placed with the designer, meaning the designer is the guarantor of the design, and the designer, they must actually take responsibility of their design failure and their design success at the same time. And we want to test that as well to see if it holds true. Also argues that design characters and judgment variability separately and combined that will allow to that can lead to successful design or a failed evil design. And also the design way argues that comprehensive needs analysis, which we know in instructional design technology as needs analysis or needs assessment and analysis, argues that that's process that is grounded in technical rationality. It does not actually prevent design failure, and it actually leads to what is known as analysis paralysis and value paralysis. So saying that, oh, in order to avoid design failure, we need to we need to make sure we do a needs analysis. Not necessarily true, and there is an evidence for that. The other major theory that guided the study is Henry Petrosky, theoretical lens on design failure. Henry Petrosky is a scholar in architecture and engineering. He has many foundational books about the area of design failure. Some of these books are there on the right side, like To Engineer as a Human, Success Through Failure, To Forgive Design, and Understanding Failure, and The Road Taken. Henry Petrosky, he views the design process as a series of steps where the designer is properly anticipating and obviating failure. He's arguing that design failure needs to be foregrounded into the discussion of the design process. So we need to think of design failure as one unifying theme or one unifying principle of the design process. He argues in the sense that at each stage in the design process, the designer effectively makes a decision to do this so this does not happen. And one of my favorite quotes from Henry Petrosky when he says, all the success of engineering as far as back in history as the pyramids and as far as the future of the wild conceptions of mile-high skyscraper may be imagined to have begun with a wish to achieve something without failure. I chose this photo of Henry Petrosky on purpose. He is in architecture and engineering. He's mostly in architecture design, but he gets to become an also expert in engineering as well, and he goes to speak at NASA. What an amazing example of showing how when we position ourselves as design scholars, we'll be able to speak to so many disciplines of design. I want to briefly go over this. I don't want to bore you with details about what's going on in the literature, so we'll skip to the exciting parts about the finding. The problem in literature is that I myself found design failure is discussed in multiple fields of design like HCI, human-computer interaction, architecture and engineering, and graphic and product design. There are so many books I found that talk about design failure very explicitly in an explicit manner through case studies, through analysis. That book, design, the one on the left here, Design Disaster, Great Design, Fabulous Failure, Lesson Learned. It goes by examples of design failures and why it failed, and scholars and design practitioners discussing failures openly. So that's why I arrived to these three conclusions that it's very important construct and it actually helps to understand design practice in situ. And there are some tools that are built in order to avoid future failure. When it comes to instructional design literature, it's a different story. What I found is that design failure not addressed explicitly, or at least similar to other fields of design. We found so many studies and empirical research focus on finding instructional design best practices. Best practice for what? To avoid failure, yes, but we're not talking about what that failure is in explicit manner. ID best practices, those who get translated to project success factors and how to make efficient design and design guidelines for preferred instructional strategies. And you need to sacrifice between efficiency, appeal, or whatever, the iron triangle by Pitt Honobine, etc. We find also there is in the books called Cases of Instructional Design Cases, authored by Peg Etmer and Krista Glazowski, and always there is this implicit communication in those cases that there is a right process to avoid failure. If a design failure happens, it means that you did not use the right process. And that's a little bit confusing. Design cases also show that failure is a valid feature for the practitioner. Jason McDonald, by the way, your professor, won one of the best design cases award from ERA, published in International Journal of Design for Learning, and he discussed there explicitly design failure. So we have evidence that is actually there, and it exists in instructional design practice. And people who do design work, like Jason and other, they actually can recognize what failure is and can actually talk about it. Yet we don't talk about it in literature. We don't talk about it enough. This is my favorite quote from Elizabeth Walling and Colin Gray when they critique that cases, the casebook, the instructional design casebook. They said, for those who see the process as responsible for appropriate design outcomes, it is tempting to conclude, as seemed to be the norm communicated by our casebooks, or at least the typical users of them, that the students did not follow prescribed processes. And this is accounted for the problems they observed in the resulting experience they had designed, but they did not carry out the process well. Their deliverables were thoughtful, and they created learning intervention that was, on paper, aligned with existing instructional design theory. Even so, the learning experience of this internally coherent and consistent content was still boring, onerous, and distinctly not aesthetic, ergo failure. Uh, so this, based on those research questions and the literature, what I did is I did a phenomenological study design, and in order to understand this phenomenon of design failure, and I relied on what we call the critical incident technique. And the critical incident technique involves like asking somebody about specific incident or specific incident of a lived experience and asking them to recall it and kind of reflect on that and talk them through it and prompt them through questions to get as much as rich narrative about that specific incident technique. And of course, I did a pilot study before I jumped into that. And, like we design, we try a rapid prototype and we get feedback. I interviewed instructional designers that have different job titles, and you get to see the table very quickly. And they must have at least 5-year experience. And I made sure that the participants are from different contexts of instructional design practice. And Jason always said that there is different perspective between instructional designers, whether from higher ed and corporate and civilian. I agree with that, absolutely. Instructional design reality different from one context to another, from corporate to higher ed, etc. But there are some very strong and unifying things between them as well. So this kind of table shows you the 17 participants. Those on the left, the pseudonyms and their job titles and the years of instructional design they have. 3 from nonprofit settings, 4 from independent consulting, 5 from higher ed, and 5 from corporate. That's how we get 17 participants. The data collection for the study is primarily, let me see here, there's something in the chat. Uh-oh. Let's see. I wonder if there is absence talk of design for identity. Okay, this is a question from Steve. Okay, Steve, absolutely. We have time for Q&A. I'll address your question, buddy. So it's a semi-structured and guided, CD-guided interviews. That's the main data collection. When I basically ask instructional designer to share a story of a design project in which failure occurred and prompt them through a question in order to understand how they define design failures and to what they attribute it. And of course, I practice this technique in the pilot study. Interviews to check for into what we call a meaning field analysis table. And then we get into possible themes, and the cycles are very iterative. So I go back to revisit the meaning field analysis when I arrive at a possible findings and go back to number one. It's really not linear as much as very cyclical and iterative. So this is an example of one statement. It goes, this is the original statement here, and then I clarify it by just making it more concise and or expand on it. Then we get through the meaning field analysis here using the inner or meaning. There's a whole theoretical framework about that by Gaspekin. And then this is the kind of the possible meanings based on that statement. I define design failure as, or attribute design failure to. So this was done for every participant, for every research question, until I arrived to that meaning. And then this is kind of like the phase one. And then phase two, that's where I employed axial coding in order to kind of make those meanings more concise and more straightforward. So that happened through tables for each research question and placing statement from different participants that I interpret to have similar meanings, and then grouping the meaning to sub-theme of it. And it's also a very iterative cycle as well. It takes me about, for each participant, at least I need between 8 to 12 hours to do one research question. So it was a very extensive data analysis process. So this is an example from two participants. They're saying similar things about where they attribute the design failure. So here's where they are actually saying that about it happened because of error in their design judgment, and this is the in a sense the possible theme or something. It's clear. Okay, these are the methods that I applied in order to ensure the trustworthiness of the study, from pilot study to RV approval, etc. And let's get to the findings now. So what I got out from the study are 17 different design failure stories. Different, they are unique, but they're sometimes quite similar. And they highlighted that subjective reality of design failure in diverse contexts of ID practice. And all ID practitioners were able to share stories and comment on causes of design failure. They didn't really say to me like, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about, or, this concept is not strange to me, etc. And now when we dig to that stories, found like they define a design failure as a failure during the use of design, to speak about a state of a design, an artifact, a product, a course, a training, etc., that failed after it got produced and it was delivered to clients or was implemented to learners. And design failure as a state of design they had discovered either through a post-design evaluation or through gathering feedback about their design. And design failure was not expected by them. It kind of came as a surprise. And through that theme, we get into sub-themes. For example, fail to satisfy client or design stakeholder, fail to satisfy learners or meet their performance needs, or failed when examined through metric of success, and failed through causing intended harm or undesired events. So I draw this kind of schema of this definition of design failure. And in a sense, what I'm trying here to highlight is that, let's see here, okay. So we have this process of design here, and the process yielded to a design outcome. Could be a course or training, etc. And this is where they found the failure. The failure here after the process of design is completed and a product was, in a sense, in the large sense of the word, product was produced. It failed during the use when stakeholders or learner interacted with it, or when it was examined through metric of success, meaning like, they run a rubric to evaluate it, or it actually this product caused an intended harm. So this is in a sense the whole big schema of where design failure happened or how it happened here. This is an example statement from sub-theme A by a guy, Fred. He said, everybody signed up on the content, looked great, gave it to an instructor, and he was offended that somebody took his notes and actually turned it into training and defined how the course should be taught. He expressed that resentment as he delivered this course. There'd be times when he was delivering it, he'd see the exercise and he did it to himself, and he'd look up and he'd say, well, now Fred wants us to do this thing. So there was no true buy-in from the instructor. So he's talking about how his design failed during the use because it failed to satisfy client or design stakeholders. Or satisfy learners. We hear Bob talking about how the learners did not like to receive training via text message and they opted out from them. And here's Kelly, who talked about how they ran the design through the 4 level of evaluation, metric of success here, and the whole thing failed because it did not achieve specific results. She said, we got paid. Level 4, they got the return on their investment. I kind of feel like, no, they didn't, but I'm not going to have to be the one to say in that meeting, you know, they didn't get what they need, but they got what they asked for. From an instructional design standpoint, that's not the measure of success. It's the instructional design. The measure of success is that learn something, is that they are going to make the world difference, etc. So here she's talking about specific metric of success, and when the design was examined through that, it failed. Or here, Kathy talking about unintended consequences or undesired events. She's saying that, you know, so they just were there called shelfware. They went on the shelf and they stayed there. So a lot of money was spent on them and they were never used. So here we call about design failure that caused unintended harm or undesired event, like losing money and time. When it comes to talking about also design failure or defining design failure, it's being defined as during the process of design. And by process of design, we're speaking about event or series of events occurring during the process of design. And either it's an event that suddenly occurred that made them realize their design process failed. So it's an unexpected accident, or a series of events they experienced that led to inevitably expected failure of design during use. So it's a failing design process will be inevitably and expectedly a failure during use of design. And here I brought schema. So we're thinking of drawing the schema, we're thinking of a design process like this, and all of a sudden, there are some sudden events that solve the design process. Somebody want to talk? Okay. Or we're talking about design process here, and there are specific events here. These events here led to this failure outside. The interesting thing is that when instructional designer talked about design failure as failing during the process of design, when they talk about it here during the design process, they said like something happened all of a sudden and that was not expected. So it was like out of the blue, something happened. But here they were talking about something that they are aware of it. They were knowledgeable that they are going through events of failure, and they know that actually is going to lead to a failure during implementation or when they are done. So they're speaking of a level of awareness, like, oh, I know it is gonna fail. I know it is gonna, it's gonna flop. So this one is not an event. Claire talking about how all of a sudden the CEO was a colossal waste of time and ended up scrapping the project. Boom, that's it, done. That's a design failure at the process level. And here Amanda's saying, she's talking about, I got all the executives in the room and I was very upfront with like, okay, I'm telling you right now, this is going to be a big mess. But if you say do it, I will do it. And that is exactly what happened. We did it. It was a big mess. So we were working from the design documents, and that is the whole reason a disaster waiting to happen is because the design documents are a year old and they have delivered the system which looks nothing like the design documents. So she's so aware that she's going through design failure during the process, and she knows that the outcome is going to fail as well. There's another definition of design failure as an opportunity for reflection on design action. Designers I spoke to, they spoke how they reflected on the design failure they experienced without being asked if they did so. All of a sudden, like they talked about how that changed their design process. They talk about whether it's a design failure that opportunity to change the future design process. They said, okay, we experienced failure. I reflect on it. I learned my lesson. And that's how I changed my design process after that. And I was like, okay, it's not going to happen again. Now I'm going to account for it. And some of them said, we experienced failure. We immediately made an iteration on the design to kind of save it, to flip it back from failure to a success. It's not like to change the process, but to actually iterate on the actual design. So here there's some positive elements of design failure here. Here's a quote by Bob talking about in the future how he's going to employ more empathy with the people. He said, He said, after the project failed, I talked to my dad about it. My dad is a mechanic, and I talked to him about it. I was telling him about it. He goes, oh, yeah, I would have totally hated that. Oh, well, I should have talked to my dad first. What did I learn? We talked to somebody, that's in that word. You need to have more empathy with people who you're designing for. And here Andrew was talking about how immediately, because of he incorporated evaluation into the design phases of their design project, and when they got the feedback it failed, they immediately went into iteration and to fix it in order to avoid being a failure. We also talk about a design failure as an outcome or an event that needs to be avoided or prevented during the process. So a lot of designers saying it needs to happen it needs to be avoided during the process so it doesn't happen here during implementation. And some other saying no, it's an outcome that could not be, regardless. I mean, you can have the best successful design process and then everything goes well and man, problem happened, the design failure happened. So there's some conflicting views here among instructional designers. Some saying it's avoidable, and some others like, nope, no matter what, you cannot avoid it here. And there's some supportive statement here as well. So the last part of finding of the study is the elements that design failure are attributed to. So found that design practitioner attribute first failure to action of design stakeholders and collaborators, saying it's not my fault, it's other people's fault. Fair enough. Some others are saying, nope, it's actually my fault. It's actually my own action and judgment. And to be frank with you, most of them said, all of them actually attributed to others. Very few of them said it's others, and also I also have a responsibility. There was no designer that said it's totally my fault. At least the 17 I talked to. None of them said, nope, I take responsibility for the whole thing, which is a little bit concerning, to be frank with you. Third one, some designers said, I attribute to workplace culture and politics. I mean, the boss, and we have this bureaucracies, and we have these processes. And others talked about, like, one person said, no, it failed because I've tried to follow this specific instructional design theory by David Merrill, and it failed. He actually mentioned David Merrill by name, and he was so had a what's the word? He had strong opinions against David Merrill's and David Merrill's instructional design theory there, and the first principles of instructions, all of that. He was like, oh, yep, but failed because of that. It's not because of anything else. So here's, like, for example, they speak about how design stakeholders or other cause failure by noting that they have actually a role in the design process, and they actually the one who introduced failure. Some saying, like, well, me as a designer, I felt like I failed because I wanted to push back and say, hey, we don't have time to make this is the best it could be. Even with the time that we have, I don't think we could have made it 80% the best could be. So it's just something that they wanted to be done in that calendar year. It was before. So it switched. Here we're switching between I to they. It was something they wanted to be done that calendar year, etc. But there is a sense here, like, yeah, she is acknowledging, Elizabeth, here, that she actually failed because she didn't make the decision to push back and say no. And here people talking like, oh, it was administrative systemic issue. There was a process. The process existed, but the process wasn't followed. My department asked the folks who implement the process, who act on that process, are not in position to enforce the process. Keyword here is the process, workplace culture and politics and structure. No, it's not me. It's the process. And here's Bob is talking. I think there is one of the issue in instructional design is that when you're designing instruction for entities, there are always those forced-on features. Something can actually be like, for instance, if you develop a course for a university and they tell you every course has to have at least 3 quizzes, or every course has to have at least 1 multimedia integration, or when there's forced-on feature are there, we don't always consider what the ramification of this forced-on feature is going to be. And he wanted to even on a rant on David Merrill and saying, like, well, I don't care. I mean, David Merrill is not genius, and even if he wrote it. So what we can kind of make of that? We make that there is a really rich and complex way that instructional designers here define design failure in IT practice. This complex and rich definition are not entirely captured in design theory and instructional design scholarship. This is my contribution here to literature and to theory. And this points to that there is a well-known gap between theory and practice, or theory is not able to capture the rich and complex way instructional design practice is happening. Or another way, how IDT theory is not entirely grounded in practice. And really how general descriptive design theory is relevant to IDT discipline. I went from a theoretical perspective coming from engineering design and from architecture, went to instructional design, and things are relevant there. Wow. Other thing it points to is that there are multiple elements that ID practitioner attribute design failure to, mostly to elements out of their control, unlike what general design theory suggests. So remember Nelson Storm was saying, no, designers need to be the guarantor of design, designers need to be responsible for what they take, etc., for their success in the field of design. That doesn't hold to be true. We can see here most elements points to other things. Designers are taking very partial and limited responsibility of design failure. And this shows how design tools suggested by instructional design scholars are not preventing design failure because they're happening. We have evidence here saying, I follow this model, I follow this theory, I follow this process, it doesn't work. And still failure happen. All of these tools are not grounded entirely in practice. They're not designed in this sense. And how general descriptive design theory is relevant in IDT discipline to a limited extent, not to a great extent as well. And now we are arriving to kind of what this kind of failure mean to them. So design failure here is in essence is a lived design experience. Arguably has positive and a negative side, but is actually full of tension. We can't talk about design failure as productive failure. Oh, it's something positive and you learn from it. No, it's not, doesn't have that positive side only. It has a negative side, so it's full of tension. And it's a lived design experience. We can't talk about design failure without actually living it, without actually going through it. This is based on the multiple definition of design failure that I showed and the multiple elements that ID practitioner attribute design failure to. So now how this gonna make implication for, remember my goal when I started from the beginning that I want to make instructional design scholarship, make implication for instructional design scholarship and education. So for scholarship, we need to address it more explicitly. We need to acknowledge it as a lived experience that arguably has positive and negative side. Scholars who suggest design tool for ID practice should account for the following: that design failure cannot be fully addressed with what we have. We need to expand our repertoire of design tools and theories and things in order to prevent failure. If we rely on the ADDIE model or specific 4C ID models or what we currently have, that's not preventing design failure. Whether designer employed needs analysis or not, implemented an instructional design method or not, follow design guideline best practice or not, design failure still occur. So it needs to be accounted for here is the designer judgment and their appreciation of those design tools. And educators, those who teach instructional design classes, need to explicitly address design failure through education experience, meaning that as a design student, you need to go through failure in order to live it. You need to reflect on it as well. You need to have time to process it. And you need to experience design failure so that you'll be ready to experience future failures or to minimize the impact of future failures. Also, you enhance your ability to make stronger design judgments as well. It also enhances your ability to have ethics and values that actually allow you to say, it's my responsibility as a designer to make this design a success. And that's how, like, moving forward, the kind of future research. You have been an excellent audience. I hope I didn't bore you with this long presentation. Thank you, and would love to hear your questions.
I have a question about, maybe this is about future studies, but have you followed anyone or done a little bit of research into anyone who's had multiple failures, the same designer with multiple instances of failures, and, just talk about that for a minute.
There was one, so the 17 stories that I summarized, there is one designer gave me more than one story of failure. And she was an experienced designer, senior level. And I haven't, from what I've seen, there are some connections between them. And there's always what I've seen is that she's always trying to account for new things to happen. I haven't done, in a sense, like following one participant or through that. This study is quite fresh. Actually, I defended it just in August. So I didn't have time to do more follow-up studies yet. Excuse me. I want to address the question by Steve here. He said, I wonder if the absence of talk design failure in the IDT lit follows the tendency of journals to publish successful experiment and avoid experiment with no significant result. Could be similar tendency? Absolutely. Yes, we care much about success. We care much about significant results, things that work. Things that fail, nobody want to hear about that, things that fail, they're like, hey, this is negative. This is so depressing, this is one of the things that I said also in the study is that I feel like instruction design technology as a discipline overall, we are more tolerant to failure than other disciplines of design. We're more tolerant to it because we think failure is part of learning. Fine, if we are tolerant, let's talk about it explicitly. Let's put it in front and center. In engineering design, for example, Petrosky is saying, no, engineers right now in 21st century have no right to fail because we have developed much more rigorous methods and tools that account for failure. Ming Xin said, Ming Xin said, what is your favorite failure? The guy Bob was my kind of favorite story. He talked about how he designed with other people and he did the pilot and he got really good success. How he designed the training for bus driver through mobile learning. It was through short messages. And the snippet of training will go through text messages. And they thought it's gonna boom. And because of FTC regulations, they have to put the opt out. So bus drivers started opting out from the text. So they got declined, and all of a sudden nobody's taking the training. I was like, oh my God, it was an interesting historical case as well. The other guy named Fred also talked about a very interesting failure when he designed the thing, gave it to the instructor, and the instructor was delivering. He was like, now this designer wants us to do this activity. And he would be like, the designer had no buy-in of that, That was it. All of them were very interesting stories, but these two were the most. Karen, what kinds of product were involved in the failure course product, etc.? Can you clarify a question by you mean by products?
Yes. What kinds of what were they making? Were they designing courses? Were they designing some kind of product to be used in a course? What kinds of things were involved in the failures?
So I spoke, designer from different contexts. A lot of them higher ed spoke about courses with faculty, mostly online. Folks in corporate and nonprofit talked about training. Some of them about self-regulate training, some of them about workshops, some of them about more like a train the trainer thing. They're mostly courses and trainings and handouts, stuff like that, yeah. Spencer, what are your thoughts on current IDT curriculum? I say it depends on the IDT curriculum. I can't make a blanket statement and say all IDT curriculum sucks. It depends. I know that some programs are better than others, and there is a reason for that. I think I come from a very good program, IUIST, and that's because there's a level of rich and experience and diversity among faculty that wants to always push further. Programs, I think, that still ground students in very traditional ISD or EdSec psychology, I can tell you that they're missing. There is some missing opportunities over there. James, if a pilot study fails, is that still considered a failure in your research? Yeah, if a pilot study fails, it actually tells you what to do in order to make your study successful. So yeah, if a pilot study fails, means that you're asking the wrong question or there's something problematic in the design. It's a failure. It's not a failure in the research. It's actually used purposely to avoid a failure in the process in research. Duan, you mentioned that none of the IDT practitioners felt like their failure were entirely their fault. Yes. Do you think that the failures were primarily due to practitioners or to external forces? If it is external forces, how can we be trained to account for that? This is a very good question. I think the IDT practitioners I talked to, none of them was able to take full responsibility of their failure. All of them took some partial, very limited responsibility of their failure. It's because the way they were trained to do design. They were trained to trust models, theories, processes in order to avoid failure. They were not trained to believe in their design character. They were not trained to believe in their design judgment. They were not trained to say, believe in your values and your judgment and your instinct in order to address failure. So because we train them traditionally to trust the model, to trust the theory, to follow what the needs analysis do, etc., to not follow your instinct, to actually have your things in ground data, etc., they outsource that responsibility to the process. So that's why they're saying it's not my fault. It's the tools I use. It's the process I use. It's the other things I use. Where if we told them from the very beginning that you are the designer, you are the responsible of design success and failure, and all these tools and method and theory, think of them as tools at your service, tool to serve your design work, not to guide your design work. And you are the true guarantor of the design in the sense that you have to make the best design judgment about when to use this tool, etc. And it's totally fine to start a design without making any needs assessment and analysis by following actually your judgment about how to move forward. If we train them like that, they will take responsibility of their design. There are still external forces, but you have to account for external forces in the sense that you need to believe that you are responsible for this thing, not the other way around. Jacob, how did you distinguish between an overall design failure and a refinement? Perhaps you prototype an activity and it doesn't help learner to meet the learning objective, so it needs to be adjusted. That happens a natural part of the design process. Yes, that's what we call like more purposeful failure. And it can happen as a strategy of testing. That's like more like a user testing as a method to get early feedback, etc. So I left it, the beauty of the study is that I left it up to instructional designers to tell me what design failure mean to them. There is one participant who talked about that purposeful testing in the design process to make sure that it's working or not, but he didn't feel that that's a design failure. He meant it more like as a purposeful way to test something to see if it works or not. But that's different from design failure. I would call it, that's a user testing or A/B testing or some kind of method of testing.
All right, we are going to have to stop the session here. Ahmed, thank you so much for your thoughts and presentation. We are grateful for you spending a little bit of time with us today. Let's thank Ahmed for his attention to our seminar today. Ahmed, is it all right if they contact you if they have other questions or things they'd like to follow up on?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, feel free to email me those questions. Sorry I haven't the chance to address them, and yeah, let me know. I'll be happy to respond to them.
Okay. We have an after party thing for some students, so we'll excuse you now. And thank you again for your time. Let you get back to the conference that you're attending as well as I'm attending, I know. I'll stop the recording as well at this point.
Thank you, everyone.